The director of the movie Avatar said testosterone is a toxin that you have to work out of your system.
Maybe actually the most shallow form of masculinity is the idea, what is it? Get rich, live fast, and leave a beautiful corpse. That's what Andrew Tate is talking about. It's kind of like, Jordan Peterson with no morals and no shirt.
The Industrial Revolution took work out of the home. And of course, men had to follow their work out of the home into factories and offices. And for the first time, they were not working with people they loved and had a moral bond with, the family members.
Welcome back to the Bridgehead, everyone. Today we're going to have a very helpful interview with Nancy Pearcey, a best-selling author and speaker. She is a former agnostic and has been hailed in The Economist as America's preeminent evangelical Protestant female intellectual. Her work has appeared in The Washington Post, The Washington Times, First Things, Human Events, The Daily Caller, CNS News, Fox News, and has appeared on NPR, C-SPAN, Fox and Friends, and here on the Bridgehead. She is currently a professor and scholar in residence at Houston Christian University. Her books have been translated into 19 languages and include Total Truth, The Soul of Science, Saving Leonardo, Finding Truth, Love Thy Body, and The Toxic War on Masculinity, which will make up the subject of this interview. What is masculinity like in the 21st century? Is toxic masculinity a real thing? How should we understand people like Andrew Tate? Nancy and I discuss all of that and more.
I wanted to start off by chatting about your newest book on toxic masculinity. What made you decide to tackle the subject of masculinity after you had tackled, Love Thy Body, art criticism? It seems like a kind of a deviation from the things that you usually write about.
It is, isn't it? And I have to tell you, my eye was caught by what I thought was shocking headlines. Like the Washington Post had an article titled, "Why Can't We Hate Men?" in a mainstream publication.
Yeah.
And a Huffington Post editor tweeted #KillAllMen, and that said it was a joke. Speaking of jokes, you can buy T-shirts that say "So many men, so little ammunition." And there are books very bluntly titled, with titles like "I Hate Men" and "No Good Men" and "Are Men Necessary?" But what I thought was really tragic was that even some men have jumped on that bandwagon. There's a fairly well-known male book author who wrote, "Talking about healthy masculinity is like talking about healthy cancer."
Oh, wow.
And then finally, you may have seen this one because it was in the news. The director of the movie Avatar said testosterone is a toxin that you have to work out of your system. And so I really wanted to understand where this is coming from. You're right, it's somewhat different, but all my books have something to do with apologetics, with defending a biblical view. And this was a case where I thought, where is this secular view of masculinity coming from? And how can we respond to it with an effective, healthy, positive, biblical view of masculinity?
So what's really interesting is that we see kind of toxic masculinity discussed constantly, and it's never discussed on the other side, right? Because presumably there's such a thing as toxic femininity as well. And if we were going to discuss these things, discussing them in conjunction would make a lot of sense. Where, in your view, is this sort of hatred for men coming from in our culture?
Well, I found it goes back much further than I would have thought. Most people think probably 1960s, second wave feminism. But when I started looking into it, I found just as much hostile language, provocative language, all the way back to the 19th century. And the reason is that it actually started with the Industrial Revolution. Because before that, men worked alongside their wives and children all day on the family farm, the family industry, the family business. And so the cultural expectation on men focused a lot more on their caretaking role. And even secular historians will say things like this. The definition of masculine virtue was duty to God and man. And I thought, whoa, where did we lose that definition of masculine virtue? Well, the Industrial Revolution took work out of the home. And of course, men had to follow their work out of the home into factories and offices. And for the first time, they were not working with people they loved and had a moral bond with, their family members. Instead, they were working as individuals in competition with other men. And that was a very different work environment. And that's the first time you start to see the literature change, that people begin to protest that men were becoming egocentric, ambitious, self-centered, competitive, greedy, and acquisitive, to use the language of the day. And to my surprise, often using the language of idle, that instead of using their work as a way to support their family, working as an individual made it much easier to redefine work in terms of individual success and professional advancement and so on. And so you find surprisingly negative language already back in the 19th century. And of course, that does suggest where we need to fix it as well. You know, we need to find ways to reconnect men to their families even today.
I have a couple of theories of my own I wanted to run past you, but I guess first I wanted to start with where do you think that the hatred of men is rooted? Why do you think that this hatred exists? So we can see, okay, they left the family home. They're not working with people that they love anymore for the most part. This begins this process of sort of alienation, fragmentation, and begins all these different processes. But if you look at these headlines that you just quoted now and these book titles that you just quoted now, where would you say that is coming from?
Well, at the same time that men were leaving the home, the American society was becoming more secular. And so secular views of masculinity became more popular. After the Industrial Revolution, there arose a large public sphere of factories, industries, financial institutions, universities, and of course the state. And people began to argue that these public institutions should operate by scientific principles, by which they really meant value-free. Don't bring your private values into the public realm. And since it was men attending those secular universities and working in that secular environment, they did become secular, historically, before women did. And so their behavior was no longer as restrained by biblical ethics. And so in the 19th century, there was a huge increase in what are considered sort of traditional male vices like drinking and gambling and crime and prostitution. Sometimes a single fact can crystallize it. So in 1830, Americans drank 3 times as much as they do today. So there was a reason there was a temperance movement. So there was a huge increase in reform movements to try to respond to this. And a lot of the negative rhetoric was coming out of these reform movements because they were basically treating men as though they were just naturally more prone to sin and vice and crime because those were the issues they were dealing with. And, I would say, no, they're not. They're not more prone to sin and vice. We're made in God's image, men and women, both and alike. So, but it was a historical change at that time because men were growing more secular. And so their behavior was more objectionable.
Well, so this kind of gets to what I wanted to ask you, because the difference, men are not more subject to vice than women are, but the truth is that when men carry a lot of vices, when men are bad, it's worse for society in many ways because men are stronger. They can do more damage. They can perpetrate more violence, right? If you get, a sort of a left hook to the face from a young woman versus a young man, there's a very big difference between those two things. And one of the things I spend a lot of time doing is talking to young people about pornography. I spoke to several hundred students yesterday from grades 9 through 12. I'm talking about pornography. And question after question after question, and I've had this for years now, the questions that I'm getting from young women are like, how do we date anybody in an environment where young men are weaned on pornography and pornography is violent? They're asking us to engage in these sort of these unnatural and horrific behaviors. Much of the kinds of things that they're learning aren't even really sexual so much as just sexualized violence, like choking and things like that. And so I find that a lot of the anti-male attitudes in younger women come from their own personal experiences and come from the fact that the pool of young men has been thoroughly poisoned by digital pornography. And so how do we kind of factor that in and have discussions where I hear horror stories all the time? I remember saying to one of my friends a while back, I kind of, after the 5th or 6th story in a row, I started to realize why feminists became man-hating when they were sitting in one of these like abuse offices at a university campus, right? You can only hear so many of those stories before you start to get really upset. And when you hear a lot of those stories, you start to think, well, men are like this. So how do we kind of recognize that our culture is uniquely toxic for men and it is poisoning their minds, and that's having a ripple effect on the war between the genders? Yeah,
I have 2 answers to that. And one is historical. when men were gone from the home after the Industrial Revolution, that meant fathers were not raising their sons anymore. And we are so used to it today that we fail to realize how traumatic it was at the time. I found literature from the time saying, that the greatest issue of our day is paternal neglect. That was one magazine article said, because the father's no longer performing his duties to his children. Or another one that said, the mainstay of the family, the father, is out of the home all day. The head of the women's Christian temperance movement, which many people say she was the most influential woman of the 19th century, Frances Willard, put it this way. She said, God is our father, and yet the prototype of the divine is gone from the home from weekend to weekend. And perhaps the leading psychologist of the day said, never before have young boys been so wild. And it's because they're half orphaned. That was his word, meaning, the father's not there. And he said, boys are now being raised by women in the home, school, and church. And so even at the time, people acknowledged that boys' behavior was growing worse. They were becoming wild and unruly and unmanageable. And so that was another reason for the huge increase of crime, drinking, prostitution, and so on in the 19th century. But I'd like to bring it up even closer to our own day, because I think this is influencing us equally. And that is, what are some of the secular definitions then, the secular scripts for manhood? Well, in my book, I go through several stages, but one of the most important ones, I think, is the rise of Darwinian evolution. And that's kind of surprising because we think, that's a scientific theory. But it had huge impact on definitions of masculinity, because a social Darwinist immediately began to say that the men who won out in the struggle for survival would be brutal, savage, barbarian, violent, and sexually predatory. And so instead of encouraging men to live up to the image of God in them, they basically said men should live down to the beast within. That was one of their favorite phrases. And it's not called social Darwinism anymore. It's got a new name. It's called evolutionary psychology. But it has the same message. There's a best-selling book called The Moral Animal. Best-selling, I emphasize. And the author says the human male is a possessive, flesh-obsessed, that's how he puts it, flesh-obsessed pig. Giving men a booklet on how to have a better marriage is like giving Vikings a booklet on how not to pillage. And I thought, how does he get away with this? Well, I guess because, he can claim it's scientific. And then you may have seen this one because it's an older book that was recently reissued called Of Men and Marriage. And he says the same thing. He says, men are by nature violent, irresponsible, and sexually predatory. Their deepest yearning is not for family, for wife and kids, but for the escape, the group escape. He called it the male group escape, the open road and the motorbike to a place of immediate gratification. And I thought, really? You think this is how God made men? Immediate gratification, escape, running away from their responsibilities to their wives and children? I think it's very dangerous when these messages get out there. And basically, this is the source of the Andrew Tate phenomenon. It didn't come out of nowhere. It came out of intellectuals writing like this, saying that if we're going to be true to the Darwinian vision, we have to see men as these immoral beasts. And so if we want to counter it, we have to also look at these intellectual roots of this negative view of men. And I'll tell you, this is what kids are absorbing. I got a email recently from a former graduate student of mine who now teaches high school. And she said, all of my male students are fans of Andrew Tate. They're even using Andrew Tate quotes in their yearbook. I said, where do you teach? At a classical Christian school. So if we're not getting an alternative to the secular script, that's healthy and strong and responsible, then they're going to be absorbing these scripts from these online influencers.
Well, so there's a couple of issues with that, of course. First, I would, in response to them saying it's like giving Vikings a book on how not to pillage. It's like, well, we actually did give the Vikings that book. It was the Bible, and it worked pretty effectively. Right, the Vikings.
That's a really good point.
Many of the Vikings converted to Christianity, and so I would say that the Bible would also, of course, apply to men. But then, secondarily, what really disturbs me about the story of Andrew Tate becoming popular in a classical Christian school, and I see this a lot in Christian schools. Like I was sort of alerted to Andrew Tate by young people when I give these talks on pornography. They were asking about all these various quotes. I'm like, who is saying this kind of stuff? And it's like, there it is. It's kind of like Jordan Peterson with no morals and no shirt. And the difficulty with it was, it's like, well, if you're in a classical school, they are actually getting what we thought was the alternative to sort of the bankrupt, secular state schools, right? They are being introduced to the great classics. They are presumably being introduced to the great heroes of Western civilization. Like presumably a thoroughgoing classical education is actually giving people all of this stuff. Maybe not in video format, but if a real fully integrated classical education isn't part of the answer, then how do we respond? How do we compete with guys like Tate when they're playing by a different set of rules?
Yeah, and by the way, the New York Post has announced a new Andrew Tate. They actually called him the new Andrew Tate, and it's Myron Gaines. And
he's a horrifying anti-Semite to boot.
And his tagline is, "I help men transform from simps into pimps." But again, I got that from some Christian male friends who like Myron Gaines, so that was disturbing. What I offer in my book as a biblical view. Most books on masculinity from a Christian perspective are kind of devotional, and what I do is I look at sociological data on Christian men, and they've been targeted, of course, because most people, the secular media narrative is that Christian men are exhibit A of toxic masculinity. And so since they were targeted, social scientists started saying, well, where's your evidence? You're making these accusations, but where's your data? And so they went out and did the studies. And I quote about a dozen studies in my book. And to everyone's surprise, they do test out as the most loving and engaged husbands and fathers. And by the way, even in Christian circles, you'll find the negative stereotype. I was surprised how many, for example, just to quote one, this was the co-founder of the Church Too movement, which followed the Me Too movement. And she said, the theology of male headship feeds the rape culture that we see permeating American Christianity today. And so I think it's really important that we can go out and look at the actual studies and find that that's just not true. In fact, the first question I get, by the way, is, well, did they ask the wives? And yes, they did. And the wives report the highest level of happiness of any group in America. Evangelical fathers spend more time with their kids, 3.5 hours more per week than secular men. Evangelical couples are the least likely to divorce, 35% less than secular couples. And the real surprise is they have the lowest rate of domestic abuse and violence of any group in America. So giving the Vikings the Bible, by the way, my ancestors were Vikings from Norway and Sweden. My grandfather came over from Sweden. So the Bible did work. They're all Lutherans. But what happens is... Well, let me give you a quote. Sometimes a quote really can kind of crystallize it. So the sociologist who did the largest study was Brad Wilcox at the University of Virginia.
Yeah.
And yeah, I'm sure you know him. And you know that his stature is such that he gets published in places like the New York Times. So he wrote an article in the New York Times in which he said, and this is a direct quote, "It turns out that the happiest of all wives in America are religious conservatives. Fully 73% of women who hold conservative gender values and attend church regularly with their husbands have high-quality marriages." Then he turns to his secular colleagues. Sociology is a very secular field. And he says, academics need to cast aside their prejudices against religious conservatives and evangelicals in particular, because they do test out Protestant evangelical fathers, he says, test out as the most loving husbands and fathers. And so we have solid empirical research. This is not a pep talk from some religious leader. It is carefully researched empirical findings that we should be very confident about bringing, both into religious settings and into the public sphere to debunk the negative secular stereotype.
I find it very difficult to discuss so much of sort of complementarianism. Like, I'm a religious conservative person, but there's so many things that we used to talk about that are more difficult to talk about now because of how some language is used, right? I've talked to older pastors this way and said, when you talk, for example, about, say, like, biblical submission, in a culture where young men are being addicted to pornography between grades 6 and 8, this language it means something very different to them than it would have been to their parents. And so it's not that Bible doctrines are outdated. It's that you need to be culturally literate and understand what the input is, because this is where sort of abusive stuff can happen, right? So how do we navigate as religious conservatives, having these conversations while recognizing the context in which that is being received? Does that make sense?
Oh, totally. Yes. I mean, submissive means something very different in the context of pornography. But in fact, it even means something different to a lot of Christians. So when I talk about this positive data on Christian men, the first pushback I always get is, but haven't we all heard that Christians divorce at the same rate as the rest of the culture? Mm-hmm. And so the sociologists went back to the data and they made a very important, crucial distinction between men who actually attend church regularly, for whom their religious convictions are very sincere, very authentic, from people who claim a Christian identity, but attend church rarely, if at all. So nominal Christians. My students don't know what the word nominal means, so I explain to them NOM is Latin for name, so it means in name only. And so these are men who, on a survey like this, might check, say, the Baptist box, but who don't attend church. It's a cultural or family background. And these men test out shockingly different. Their wives report the lowest level of happiness. They spend the least amount of time with their kids. They have a higher rate of divorce even than secular couples, 20% higher than secular couples. And the real shocker is they have the highest rate of domestic abuse and violence of any group in America. The same Brad Wilcox, the sociologist I quoted earlier, wrote an article for Christianity Today. And his summary statement was, the most violent husbands in America are evangelical Protestants who don't attend church, claim the identity but don't actually live it. And so this is what we're up against. It's not that it's not only the secular culture, but so many people who claim a Christian identity are using language like headship and submission, but infusing them with meanings from the secular culture. And that's one reason I wanted to write a book analyzing the secular scripts, because otherwise our young people don't have a critical grid and they're just going to absorb whatever the secular culture is saying. And I think that's why we see this phenomenon of nominal Christians actually being worse than secular men.
That's a very important point you make, because I remember being very depressed, when I started looking at data, even 15 years ago when I was researching a bunch of these subjects and thinking like, so does Christianity make no impact on behavior? And then looking at the data, I'm like, well, the data that actually matters is church attendance, not religious identification, right? There's my favorite story about cultural Christianity is Rod Dreher's story about when he converted to Catholicism and his dad got upset. And he said, the Drehers are Methodist. And Rod said, you never took us to church. And he said, the Methodist church is the church we don't go to. And I thought that was a good way of describing, it's a cultural identifier, right? And so what happens when you say, well, so if people go to church at least twice a month, does that make a difference? And as soon as you start factoring those things in, porn consumption drops, all of these things start to drop, and you're saying, okay, so being a practicing Christian actually does make a real world impact on behavior. And this is one of the questions I really wanted to ask you, because I really enjoyed a lot of the work that you've been doing on this issue. I enjoy your Twitter feed and commentary on masculinity as well. And masculinity is obviously one of the hottest topics there is right now, because there's so many competing voices. And so Aaron Renn spent a lot of time on this particular subject, not only on his Substack, but in his recent book, Life in Negative World, where he basically says, the church isn't speaking to men, which is why Jordan Peterson is filling stadiums and we're not filling churches. Now, the most recent numbers actually indicate that the rate of American men attending churches is on the rise. So we'll see where that kind of unfolds. But sometimes the church can't offer what the culture is offering, and I wonder if there's sort of a conundrum we haven't struggled with thoroughly enough there, right? We had like Mark Driscoll, the cussing pastor, who really tried to sort of show aggressive masculinity to address men in a strong voice and all that kind of thing. Didn't work out so well. Like there are aspects of sort of macho masculine culture that are fine from your fitness instructor, but aren't fine from your pastor. There are areas in which I just don't think the church can compete, in areas where it wouldn't be appropriate for the church to compete, because Jordan Peterson isn't a pastor and a pastor shouldn't be Jordan Peterson. So how do we square that circle? How do we take a look at how men are being failed and say, well, what is the church capable of biblically offering in this space?
Oh, yes, that's such a good question. So I think too many Christians have sort of baptized a secular view. I was careful in my book not to name names, but I will tell you, books like Wild at Heart, I was amazed at how they picked up the word wild from the 19th century. Because, well, let me give you some background, because this is fun. Because of the 19th century had such an outbreak in men behaving worse, becoming more secular, many of the reform movements were driven by women, right? Because if you take values out of the public square, where will they be cultivated? In the private sphere. And who's still in the private sphere, in the home and church, was women. And so in the 19th century, for the first time, we got this double standard where women were said to be morally and spiritually superior to men. Most people think, well, hasn't that been forever? No, it was completely new in the 19th century. All the way back to the ancient Greeks and Romans, it was thought that the insight into right and wrong was a rational insight, and that men were more rational, and therefore men were more virtuous. In fact, the word virtue, the root in the vir in Latin, means man. And so the word virtue had connotations of manly strength and honor. So this was completely new when women were said, okay, you're the ones who have to hold men in check. Men are just more naturally prone to getting drunk and, visiting prostitutes. So it's women who have to hold them in check. Well, after a while, toward the end of the 19th century, men got tired of that. And a new word entered the English vocabulary. It was over-civilized. It was the idea that men were no longer these tough, rough guys growing up out in the, on the frontier. And that to recover their true masculinity, they had to get away from civilization, away from women and family, and go out and sleep under the stars with the cowboys. And so there's a whole generation of male fiction writers who wrote stories about getting out, cowboys, frontier men, mountain men, or out to sea, Melville. And to recover their masculine identity meant getting away from civilization and especially from the impact of women, because women were the ones who were driving all these reform movements. So, it was these women who were telling men, you have to behave. At any rate, the language of getting out into the wild got picked up by Christian writers. So they're just baptizing a late 19th century theme. And I would say it's a dangerous one, because if your true masculinity is found by getting away from your family responsibilities, that is going to undercut men's motivation to commit to wife and family. And so in my book, I offer an alternative. I offer the cultural mandate. And about half of my students have ever heard that term. So the cultural mandate is what theologians call the opening chapter of Genesis, when God has created the universe, created the animals and plants, and then he creates the first human couple. And what is the very first thing he says to them? He tells them why he made them. Be fruitful and multiply and subdue the earth. Be fruitful and multiply doesn't just mean the nuclear family, because as anthropologists tell us, all of the social institutions ultimately grow out of the family, because the family becomes a clan, a village, a nation. And you need social institutions for particular purposes, like you need a school, a church, a government, a marketplace. And so it really, if you unpack that very streamlined language of Genesis 1, it means build all the social institutions. And subdue the earth means harness natural resources. So there's all the arts and sciences, right? Again, it starts with agriculture in most cases, but then it goes on to mining and technology and building laptops and composing music. I had a student once who said, oh, come on, composing music? So I said, I play the violin. What's a violin made out of? Wood and the bow, horsehair. So all the transcendent beauty we associate with the arts also starts with harnessing the natural resources of the creation that God has given us. And so theologians call this the cultural mandate because the idea is that this is pre-fall. This was the original purpose for which God created the human race, was to create cultures, to create civilizations, to make history. And so I think that gives men in particular a much better model of what it means to be a man. And, roll up your sleeves, don't escape, don't go out into the wild, don't think, mountain climbing and whitewater rafting is how you discover your masculinity. Nothing wrong with those activities, but it's not how you affirm your masculinity. Your masculinity is mostly affirmed by rolling up your sleeves and getting deeply engaged with the social world, starting with your wife and family, and with creative and productive work, that glorifies God and helps people. So the cultural mandate is is what I suggest is what we should be preach. And like I said, especially to men, because it gives men a sense of accomplishment. I think men have a little bit more of that drive towards accomplishment, achievement, mastery, and so on. And the cultural mandate really speaks to that.
Yeah, Anthony Eslin touches on that as well in his book No Apologies, which is basically his just defense of masculinity, and there's a lot of overlap between your book and his. But I want to kind of unpackage some of these questions. Like that was a very helpful answer but sometimes I think that we overthink some trends. So I'd like to hear what you think about the Andrew Tate phenomenon in one way, right? So when Andrew Tate first got really, really famous, you had a lot of think pieces and a lot of people writing about how he is a symbol of the fact that people have no male role models anymore. And so like in the absence of good male role models, then, here's this Andrew Tate guy, and he's clearly very jacked and he has a lot of money and he's got nice cars. I'm not totally certain though that that's everything that there is to it, because again, as you say, this stuff is happening at Christian schools. I'm hearing about it all the time at Christian schools. I've been to some of these Christian schools. I know they have fantastic dads. They've got, and these are all blue collar people. These are a lot of people who are, they're construction workers, they're carpenters, they're farmers, they're doing physical stuff. These people these are no slouches. So Andrew Tate has proven to be enormously attractive also to people who don't lack for good father figures. Many of whom live in intergenerational families where both their grandfather and their father are still around, and both of them are really men worth emulating and looking up to. And so I think sometimes maybe in our efforts to psychologize things, we just forget that the Bible isn't kind about the wisdom of young men. And so maybe they should be told, like, actually the most shallow form of masculinity is the idea, what is it? Get rich, live fast, and leave a beautiful corpse. That's what Andrew Tate is talking about. And sometimes it's like, well, no, it might not be any hunger at all, except for the classic materialism and this desire to be rich and this desire to be attractive and a desire to attract a lot of females. I don't buy that the Andrew Tate phenomenon is born only out of this desperate need for father figures or for masculine men. I think he's born just as much out of the fact that he's the next slickster selling the same product that the human heart is prone to fall for, which is we want that stuff. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, well, I do think though that we're not hermetically sealed off from our culture, and the culture has been communicating a very negative view of men. In 2020, there was a survey done in which 50% of American men said, these days society seems to punish men just for acting like men. And there was in 2024, there was an international study in which 60% of men said discrimination against men is now just as bad, if not worse, than discrimination against women. A psychotherapist who writes for the Wall Street Journal said, especially young men, she said, the young men coming into my practice feel demoralized and defeated and beaten down because they feel like they're growing up in a culture that's hostile to masculinity. I teach at Houston Christian University. When I told my class I was writing a book on masculinity, immediately one male student shot back, "What masculinity? It's been beaten out of us." And so I think, and in fact, let me give you one more example. This was just recently, an Australian tabloid featured on the front a picture of a young boy who looks like about 6 years old. And it says, "How do we prevent this boy from becoming a monster?" And underneath it said, "How do we fight the menace of toxic masculinity?" 6-year-old boys are being told they're monsters or potential monsters. So I think we can't totally deny that even kids growing up in good homes with fathers, like you said, are being exposed to very toxic language. And I do think it's the reason that boys and men are doing worse today. Boys are doing worse than girls all the way, from kindergarten up. Even in kindergarten, they have less fine motor control than girls, so they can't use the scissors as well. So already in kindergarten, they feel like they're falling behind. And they're behind all the way through grade school, high school. I teach at a university, and I was surprised to hear that universities are now 60% female students and only 40% male. And there are more females than males going to graduate school and even professional school like law and medicine. And once they're adults, they're also falling behind. Men are much more likely than women to be prone to sex and alcohol addiction, homelessness, mental illness, crime, obviously. Some 90% of prison inmates are male. But today, their unemployment has skyrocketed. It's not showing up in the unemployment statistics because they've stopped looking. So what they now call it is male labor participation, and it's at Great Depression era levels. Great Depression era. I mean, we remember what a crisis that was. And their life expectancy has gone down, and much of it due to what they call deaths of despair. Women's has stayed the same, but men's life expectancy has gone down. A magazine called The New Scientist ran the numbers, and they concluded the greatest single factor now in early death is being male. And so I do think it's time for us to say we need to have some compassion on men and boys, that the negative rhetoric has in fact affected them, is affecting them. And you see, the reason girls came charged ahead in education was because we helped them. The 1972 Title IX, 1994 Gender Equity Act, we've poured millions of dollars into equity workshops and curriculum and training. And at the time, people thought, well, we're going to help girls catch up to boys. They had no idea that girls would actually charge right past boys, which is what they've done. But what it does show is that if you have programs, it does help. But we now need programs to help boys catch up with girls. And unfortunately, that's been a hard sell. The woman who wrote, by the way, we have books out now, like the Why Boys Fail, The Trouble with Boys, The Boy Crisis. And Christina Hoff Sommer wrote the first one, The War Against Boys. And she said, every time I tried to promote a program for boys, it was the feminist groups that would shoot it down. They would say, we can't have programs for boys, because that would be discriminating against girls. It's time for us to say no. We need to have special programs for boys and men now.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So what do we do about the fact that a lot of the reasons for what you're describing are actually just sort of massive technological shifts that have been they've uniquely damaged the ability of men to be men and to be successful at being men, right? Just as the Industrial Revolution brought them out of the home, separated them from the familial ecosystem with all of the trouble that it came with that. If you have the digital age, it's like suddenly physical strength. It doesn't matter nearly as much in many professions, and even more importantly is that men now have the capacity to get on their screens what they used to actually have to become men to get. So the average age of first exposure to pornography is around the age of 9. Most of them are exposed to violent pornography by the age of 12. And so their masculinity is becoming toxic before they hit puberty because of what they've been exposed to on their screens. And we end up in this situation where men used to have to become a man because they needed to be able to court a young woman. He had to be successful enough that she was willing to give him a second look, willing to actually get married to him, to entrust her future to his ability to earn a living for the family. And then, if he wanted to accomplish something, he'd have to go out and really work at it. And usually that involved, physical and intellectual adeptness. And now you've got millions and millions of video games and things like that. I often think that pornography paired with video games obviously not inherently wrong, pornography is, have had a tremendous impact on the way men live their lives, because they can get all the things that their grandparents used to have to become men for without ever leaving their house, without ever leaving sort of the proverbial parents' basement. And so a lot of the things that you just described about how men are bad off, do you think that the anti-male, like leaving aside the radical feminists for a moment, do you think a lot of the anti-male rhetoric is because there's just sort of just an anti-masculine or misandrist view in our society? Or do you think that one of the reasons men are getting so condemned and criticized is because the economic conditions we find ourselves in really have degraded masculinity? The majority of men are addicted to violent porn, and they are arousing themselves to the destruction of the feminine. Those are true things. The stats are staggering. So what do you think came first here?
Yeah, well, yeah, that's a very good question. And in my book, the Toxic War on Masculinity, I do start with my own story of growing up in an abusive home. My father was severely physically abusive. He didn't say, "Do this, I'll spank you." He'd say, "Do this, or I'll beat you." And then he did. And his favorite was the knuckle fist, one finger slightly extended to cause a sharper stab of pain. So clearly, not surprisingly, when I became a young adult, I ricocheted off into extreme feminism and read all the classic feminist books, from Betty Friedan to Simone de Beauvoir, Kate Millett, Susan Brown Miller. I mean, I always had some feminist book on my bedside table, which preceded the porn epidemic that you're talking about. But it's the same pattern. I was very much a feminist, very angry at men because of my father. And then I became a Christian as a young adult and had to sort of rethink all of this, my views of men and women. And as I say in the book, in a sense, I've been writing this book my whole life, because with such extreme abuse in my family, I've had to go through an enormous amount of psychological and spiritual healing. But I'll like to say, I do have 2 chapters on abuse in the book. And it's partly because, as I said earlier, nominal Christian men test out as having the highest rate of domestic abuse and violence. So I couldn't ignore that. I couldn't sweep that under the rug. I had to deal with that. But it addresses your question to some degree, because it says, yeah, a lot of the reason that women today are having negative views of men is because men's behavior is worse, and so that's absolutely true. And I'm not quite sure, what a societal solution is. On a personal level, the good news is that more and more books are being written for these women on how to deal with it. Do you know the ministry called Pure Desire?
I've stumbled across it, but I'm not too familiar with them, no.
Well, I just spoke there for their annual conference last week. So I was surrounded by this question, the problem with porn. One of our speakers was a former porn actor. So everyone there was dealing with this issue. And fortunately, the resources are becoming better, because only a short while ago, most of the resources blamed the woman. They blame the wife. If your husband is having porn, if he's, committing adultery, it's because you need to submit more. You need to be more loving. You need to be more forgiving. You need to make his favorite foods. You need to have sex more often, and so on. And fortunately, the books are starting to change, and they're starting to say, if there's sin in a marriage, we do what Jesus told us to do about sin, which is Matthew 18. You confront it. You call it sin. You confront it. If they don't listen to you, as Jesus said, bring a few witnesses in. If they don't listen to them, you bring it before the church. If they don't listen to them, there might be time for church discipline. But the point is that the books are starting to say it is okay for a woman to, because it's not always a woman. Sometimes it's switched. But the majority of times it's the woman. It's okay for the woman to say, what you're doing is wrong. It's a sin, and you need to deal with this.
Well, it's always been bizarre to me that two claims were made simultaneously, and it always bothered me when I came across the books, just because it didn't make sense on the face of it, which is, that men are, like they should be leaders and they should do all these great things and they build civilization, but they melt into a pool of primal passion and cannot be blamed for what they do wrong. Like the moment there's any kind of sexual temptation present, it was really strange. It's kind of like this. There's a giant Achilles heel. Like they can do anything except for restrain their own desires, except for behaving around women, except for if they're not constantly sexually satiated by their wife, who knows what they might do. And this is the kind of person you think is going to lead your home. Like it didn't make any sense to me when I read it that these two things were happening in conjunction. And I think a lot of that frankly garbage was responsible for some of the backlash that we saw later.
Yeah, well, exactly. And like I said, it goes back to the 19th century when men were let off the hook, in a sense. The secularization of the masculine script basically left men off the hook and then made women responsible for reforming society and reforming their husbands. I was on a podcast with a young Christian couple. They had recently married. And so I turned the questions back on them. And I said, do you think, in the Christian context, in Christian churches, you still see the double standard? And they said, absolutely. And they almost echoed exactly what you just said. They said, both in dating and in marriage, the message is that the man has, lust and vice just boiling under the surface. And it's up to the woman to, keep it in check. It's up to the woman to dress modestly. It's up to the woman to draw the line on their physical involvement before marriage. And
as if her primary role is to be an outlet for the raging passion of the man.
Well, but they also said what you just said. How in the world can they? This young couple, a man and a woman, was saying, how can the woman respect her husband as a leader if she's been told, he has these sinful passions just barely contained under the surface, and it's her job to help contain them? They pointed to exactly the contradiction that you just pointed to. So, coming from a young couple, they agreed with you that that's a contradictory message that we're giving to young men.
I wanted to touch briefly on the other book that came out around the same time as yours, that kind of took the Christian world by storm, which is Jesus and John Wayne, by Kristen Kobes-Dumez. Did you read Jesus and John Wayne?
Oh, sure. Yeah, I had to read all those books in my research. I'm very thorough, so yeah, I read it.
So I read it, and a couple of things struck me about it. One, it was a shame that she could not resist referring to pro-lifers, etc., without like overt contempt. Whenever she talked about any form of Christian activism or Christian politics, the assumption was that these people are fundamentally insincere, they're fundamentally hypocritical. And I know she claimed she was trying to be objective, but like I read the book with a very, very open mind, because again, I do a lot of work on the pornography issue, and I think toxic masculinity does exist. I think pornography is one of the primary drivers of it, and it's one of the things we need to address. But the book was so condescending and so contemptuous of people that I know and work with. I work full time in the pro-life movement. I know the people she's talking about, and so therefore I know that she's wrong. But there were certain things that she addressed. I thought, if this book was 150 pages shorter and written by somebody else, there is some value there. What do you think that book was sort of addressing, and what are the pros and cons of the Jesus and John Wayne phenomenon?
Well, the first thing I noticed is it starts where mine ends. Historically speaking, I've traced many of these the concept of masculinity and so on much further back.
Yes.
And I think that's one reason it's such a big job dealing with them, because they're not just phenomena that started with the 1950s. Her book starts roughly in the 1950s.
Yeah.
And I show
which
them
after seeing your material, it was like a huge flaw. It's almost like if she had started as early as you did, she might have had a totally different conclusion than she did, actually.
Yeah, and my book does show that American society was giving men permission to act worse, as it gave up a Christian ethic, and along with the sociological pressures like being out of the home, but the secularization and the impact of Darwinian evolution, which we already talked about, men's behavior was growing worse. And so I agree with you. There is a reason that terms like toxic masculinity became popular. But I just think it's, her book in particular, you're right. It was written with a sneer.
Mm-hmm.
I couldn't stand the tone.
No, me neither.
I said, this is a historian? She does make a big deal out of being a historian professionally, but it's all written with a sneer. And so that bothered me. So it destroyed it for me, even when I agreed with her. I would never write that way.
Mm-hmm.
If you want to help people, you don't mock them and ridicule and make fun of them. If you want to help men, I think people who read my book do not come away feeling as though I'm down on men. Let me give you a quick example. One of my graduate students was the head of the ministry of a large Baptist church here in the Houston area. And she said, on Mother's Day, we hand out flowers and tell the women they're wonderful. On Father's Day, we scold the men and tell them to do better. And I thought that was a great summary of how the church tends to deal with men. And so my book was very careful not to sound as though I'm blaming men or I'm down on men and making fun of them and so on. Because ultimately we want to help men, even when we acknowledge that men, I'll give you some stats. The top marriage researcher in the country, I think, generally speaking, is John Gottman. And he's known because he was a mathematician before he became a psychologist. And so he's quantified things more than anyone else. People come into his little laboratory, which he's made up like a bed and breakfast, and they get wired up so that he tests their heart rate and their sweat rate and their breathing rate and their hormones. And then, and of course, their language and their gestures. And he throws that all into a computer. And he became famous because he was able to predict with 93.6% accuracy which couples will divorce and even how long it will take. So that's how he got famous. But at any rate, he says the major cause of divorce, he calls it marital instability, because they don't always divorce. Sometimes you just fall into long-term unhappiness. So the major cause of trouble in marriage is that men do not respect their wives. He said 86% of American men do not respect their wives. They don't listen to them. They shut them off. When they try to voice their opinion, they cut them off. They shut them down. They don't listen to them. They don't, in his words, they don't accept influence from their wives. And he said, this is the major cause of marital instability. And then he's so careful. He says, this is not to blame men. They haven't been taught how to have a respectful, loving relationship with the opposite sex. And what I'm trying to help them see is how much power they have. If they're the main reason that marriages are unstable or unhappy, that means they have the power to change it. Mm-hmm. And he says that multiple times. In one book that's directed to young men, he says, you have the power to make or break your relationship. What the man does is by far the most influential in whether he has a happy marriage. And so that's the tone. The tone is, yes, men have been responsible for a lot of the problems in marriage, and especially now with the porn addiction. But the fact that also tells them that they have the power to fix it.
Yeah.
And so that can be turned into a positive message.
Well, so when we're looking at practical fixes, I honestly think that one of the best things that could be done, and the tools do exist, is if you just banned pornography. If you ban digital pornography, the impact would be immediate and it would be tremendous. Half of the culture at least would go through withdrawal for a couple of days. But eventually, the neural wiring would begin to restore itself, right? Dr. Norman Doidge talks about this in his chapter on the impact of pornography on the brain, in his book, The Brain That Changes Itself. You would see attitudes towards women change because, as the Harvard studies have shown us, when a man is looking at a pornographic image, the part of his brain that indicates tool use is actually the part of his brain that lights up. And so pornography is doing a tremendous amount of things. So I'd start by banning it, and this could be done. Like the Supreme Court precedents are all on its side. I'm not totally persuaded that we'll never get there either. I think it's more likely we'll see a porn ban before we see an abortion ban, because you've got the governments of France and the UK, everybody sort of collectively agreeing that pornography is grooming our culture in a horrifying way, and something's got to be done about it. Nepal recently banned pornography entirely when they realized that pornography had contributed to a 300% rise in the rape rate. And so I don't think it's outside the realm of possibility when people recognize that this is essentially a potent psychological, transformative, and addictive substance being pumped directly into the minds of the majority of young men during the key developmental period for them. And so then that's one. I don't think that anything else we're talking about gets better if pornography is still a major factor. Like, you can do everything else right, and if you're getting that thing wrong, I don't think that any other fixes matter. But what other fixes do you think we should start considering? Like, do you look at Aaron Wren's sort of suggestion that the church needs to be better at addressing men like Jordan Peterson does? I'm not sure how that would work. I don't think it's a pastor's job, again, to be a lifestyle influencer in the way that Peterson is, or unfortunately Tate is, or these guys from Fresh and Fit, Myron Gaines, etc. So what role, like how do we respond to this need in a productive way and show that like masculinity can be a fantastic thing, and that there are so many masculine traits that are inherent to masculinity that should be celebrated, but also should be exercised by the men who have them. How do you ride the line between hectoring and encouraging?
Well, the biggest long-term solution is the relationship between fathers and sons. I quote a psychiatrist who said, "We're not going to have a better class of men until we have a better class of fathers." And 40% of American children are now growing up apart from their natural fathers. It is the highest rate of single parenthood in the world. And so I do think that the long-term benefit of trying to reconnect fathers and sons, and of course girls too, but sons are more impacted. There were two studies done. One was on how parents are effective in passing along their religious and moral convictions. It was an award-winning, 35-year-long longitudinal study, and it found two surprising things. Number one, fathers matter more than mothers. And when I tell my class that, the girl students say, "Well, that's not fair." And I said, "Well, it's a fact." I saw the charts, right? If the father's a Christian and attends church regularly, the numbers of children who follow him are much higher. Mothers have an impact, but the charts, on the charts, it's lower. I'm sorry. But secondly, they found that the key is a warm, loving, close relationship between father and son. In other words, if the father is, perfect in his theology and a moral exemplar and a pillar of the church, but he's perceived as cold and distant and authoritarian, his kids won't follow him. They will not. And so, there was another study done, and this was more limited. It was on how do we help our sons become masculine? And ironically, it found the same thing. It said the father's own masculinity was irrelevant, whether he's more macho, stereotypically, or whether he was more gentle. That did not play a role in how masculine his son was. It was the warm, close, loving relationship. And that would give the son a healthy, secure sense of masculinity. And then the final thing we have to talk about is, well, how do you make that practical in an industrial age? Well, the pandemic actually was a game changer. Harvard University did a study in which they found During the pandemic, 68% of fathers said they got closer to their children, and they don't want to lose that. So when fathers do have a chance to be home more, working part-time from home, a hybrid situation, remote work, they do actually like it better. They like having closer relationships with their children. Another study found that 70% of fathers said that they would prefer more family time, even if it meant a lower salary. And then, of course, you've got to get the companies, the corporations on board. So I've found several quotes, that I use in my book, where CEOs said things like, hey, we found out remote work does actually function well. One CEO put it this way, we used to always be very suspicious of remote work. And then he said, this is a direct quote, the pandemic has completely exploded those fears. We were not seeing any discernible drop in productivity. So I think that, and if you ask millennials, they want better balance. Men want more time with their children. The loss of influence on your children that happened with the Industrial Revolution was a genuine loss. Feminists have made us feel like, well, the guys got the better deal because they got to go out and work and we were stuck at home. But actually, it was a huge loss for men as well to lose influence and connection with their children. And of course, the opposite side is that most women, college educated especially, do want a chance to use their gifts. So most people actually would prefer a better balance of work and home. But we have to work on that from the corporation side. I tell people, I have several quotes in the book. Bring them to your boss and show him that, you really can keep up the same quality of work with, even part-time remote work so that you have more time with your family. And I'm not saying remote work is best for everyone. I'm talking about parents. I care about kids.
Well, the summation of your proposal would be a man's place is in the home.
Yes, as it used to be. You know what? I have had Christians argue with me on this. Oh, no, it's manly to go, out into the work, leave the home and charge out into the workplace. And I say, you're talking about something that's been in existence for a couple hundred years. Through the vast majority of human history, men have worked in the home and its outbuildings. Proverbs 31, the woman there who grows crops and whatever,
real estate wrangling and all kinds of things are contained there.
She has several home-based businesses, in other words, because business economic activity was done in the home and its outbuildings. So men and women both could be involved in raising their children while doing economically productive work. And I do think that that's the ideal that we should strive towards if we can. And I've written a lot about this from the women's side. I've interviewed a lot of women who've worked from home part-time while raising their children so that they could have a better balance, so they could keep a foot in their professional goals and interests while really giving their kids the kind of care that they want to. They have high quality, high standards of the quality of care they want to give. So they want to be the ones who are there for their kids, but they also want to keep their foot in the door in terms of their skills and interests.
The final question is, how do you suggest, we'll end where we began, how do you suggest Christian parents who find their kids look at Andrew Tate videos, how do they replace what Andrew Tate is giving to their kids? How do they subvert his influence and then replace his influence?
Yeah, good question. Again, I'm going to go back to those two studies, the 35-year longitudinal study. The relationship between father and son is crucial. It's not even so much all what you say. I mean, that's part of it, but the relationship has to be there. Boys are going to be much less likely to be involved with porn. And I think you said it earlier. If you look at studies that show church attendance, porn use goes way down. Sex outside of marriage goes way down. A whole smoking and drinking goes way down. There's a whole host of behavioral issues that go down when kids are attending church regularly and with their parents, because they have to know that their parents are sincere as well. So the relationship with the parent comes first. And secondly, and making sure that they're attending church with you. And secondly, let me come back to the the cultural mandate, because, churches don't really teach that. And as a result, a lot of boys kind of get the impression that the church is teaching, Jesus meek and mild, look on me, a little child. There's a book called Why Men Hate Going to Church. And of course, I interviewed the author and read the book, but he focuses on the way that the church became feminized. And again, this is the 19th century. You've got to know this history to see where things come from. In the 19th century, as men became secular, they stopped going to churches often. And it wasn't long before churches were pretty much, membership was 3/4 female. And that's when the sort of stereotype set in that the religion is for women and children. And I think that that's still often something that boys and men pick up from church. What does it mean to be a Christian? Sit in church, pray, and sing hymns. Well, that's not very masculine sounding. So take them back to the cultural mandate. Actually, here's how I put it. In sin, we get off the track, when we sin. And in salvation, God puts us back on the track. But what was the track? What was God's original purpose for the human race? He restores us in order to fulfill the cultural mandate. And so it's a much more masculine view of our calling than just, become a Christian and pray and sing hymns and go to Bible study. A lot of guys, they don't want to sit in a circle and talk about what's your feelings on this Bible passage? But if we're teaching them the cultural mandate and affirming them when they fulfill it, how many churches affirm men in their vocation? I actually have a friend who has a church. He talked the pastors into not only, they had special ways of affirming the religious professionals, right? If you had a visiting missionary, if you had a visiting pastor, if you had somebody who was in charge of a Christian ministry. And this was in Washington, D.C. when we lived there. And my friend said, well, why don't you honor the men and women who are working on Capitol Hill? How about the men and women who are fulfilling their calling in the political arena? Bring them up to the front of the church. Honor their vocation. Get the congregation to pray for them because they are fulfilling the cultural mandate. And they should be just as honored by the church as these sort of professional religious vocations. I think that's a very key insight, that the church should be honoring men, because obviously it's men who are more likely than women to be out in the public arena, pursuing vocations like that. They should be honored for that. And they will do that. The church will do that if it's really convinced that the cultural mandate is the key blueprint, for what it means to be human.
Nancy, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you. Thank you for your probing and interesting questions. I really appreciate that.
Thank you for joining us for this conversation. If you want to hear other conversations like it, you can subscribe. You can also find our content wherever you get your podcasts, or you can head over to thebridgehead.ca where we post both written commentary and video. Thanks so much for joining us.